Genesis 17. Yeah, I was excited to learn that, of course, ever since this started, I've been watching that dashboard that Sedgwick County put out. And we're down to about 7% positive, which is stellar compared to where we were, at 25%, and it's really good. And the hospitals are now no longer at capacity. They've downgraded them from critical to cautious. Of course, not out of the woods yet. We all know that, but it's good to have good news. It's good to have good news. So we can rejoice in those things. Tonight we're going to be in Genesis chapter 17, and we had business meeting last week, and we'll try from now on to kind of post that the week before. That way, people that are joining online know what's going on. That we won't be having business meeting over the internet for obvious reasons. But the last place we were was in Genesis 16. Can anybody remind me or remind us what Genesis 16 entailed? What were we looking at? Huh? Yeah, Hagar and Ishmael. And give me a quick 20-second synopsis. What happened? Huh? Okay. That was a not very good 5-second synopsis. I need a 20-second. Okay, let me just... So, chapter 15, God formalizes His covenant with, I almost said Noah, with Abraham, or Abram at the time. He's going to change his name. I'm so glad we've gotten to the name change. So I can just start calling him Abraham from now on. So, in chapter 15, God formalizes this covenant with Abram. Remember, he walked through the pieces by himself. It's a covenant of grace. It's all God and His promise, what He's going to do. He told them about His people are going to go into a slavery in a foreign land, and they're going to be brought out 400 years later. All of those things happen. And then we move to chapter 16, and in chapter 16, we saw even after Abram received this wonderful promise, this amazing covenant ceremony that God illustrated how His promise is going to be fulfilled, they still, learning in the school of faith, I don't know how else to explain it, but they doubted really because they thought they needed to help the promise. So Sarah, of course, is barren. Sarah's getting old. Abram's getting old. And she said, basically, if this promise is going to happen, we need to do something. Here, take my servant Hagar and have a baby with her. And we talked about the cultural significance of the fact that it was pretty common for a mistress to give her slave to the husband to have a child, and that child would be the mistress's child. It would be Sarah's legal child. And then we saw all the bad things that happened because they chose to do that. All the sin that was brought to the surface. Hagar treated Sarah contemptuously. Sarah sent her off. He wanted to send her off, and Abram allowed Sarah just to do whatever she wanted to do rather than taking charge and saying, no, this is what we're going to do. And God came to Hagar in the wilderness, showed her grace, told her to go back, and it ended in that vein where the baby was born. They named the baby Ishmael because that's what God told them to name the baby. And what does Ishmael mean? Remember? God hears. That's right. God hears. He heard Hagar's cries in the wilderness. He heard Abram and Sarai's plotting in the tent. So now, in chapter 17, what's going to happen is we're going to jump forward about 14 years. Man, come on. Dustin left to get me some water, I'm sure. Somebody, Ty, go up there and move the slide. All I need to do is hit. So what's happening, I figured out what's happening. It's not my clicker. When that thing goes to sleep and it doesn't, then I have no control. You got to actually hit the arrow to move the slide, and then I got control. Thank you, sir. I don't know what's going on. Must be getting old. Man, that's good water. Just hit the right arrow. We're all about professionalism here. So, we're going to jump forward 13 years, 14 years, right? We don't know for sure. It's 13 or 14 years because he's going to say Ishmael's 13 years old now. So the last thing we saw in chapter 16 was Hagar had the baby, Ishmael's born, they named him Ishmael, and now we jump forward. Abram was 85 years old then. He said he had spent 10 years in the land. We're told that he was called to the land when he was 75, which would make him 85. Now verse 1 in chapter 17 says, when Abram was 99 years old. So in the space of the end of chapter 16 to the beginning of 17, we've jumped forward about 13, 14 years. And it says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. The first time it's used, El Shaddai. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make or give, some of your translations may say, give my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. So God announces himself again, 14 years later. So 14 years later, Ishmael's 13, 14 years old. He's a teenager. And we don't know this for sure, but the way that the text jumps from chapter 16 to 17, it could be possible, I don't know for sure, but it could be possible that God hasn't spoken to Abram in 14 years. Now, Abram's waiting on a promise, isn't he? He's waiting on the promise that was given. What was the promise? Child, many nations, going to be a great nation. We're going to give you the land. That promise was actually made 23 or 24 years before. I mean, when he called him to the land, he was 75 years old. He gave him the promise, you're going to be a great nation. You're going to have this land. Now, Abram's 99 years old. That's 23, 24 years later. How much land does Abram own? Zip. He's still nomadic. He's still moving around in the land. How many kids does he have? Other than Ishmael, 0. He has no. And so God comes and He announces Himself, I am El Shaddai, I am God Almighty, the one we're going to see in this chapter who is able to do the impossible. And He's going to show Abram that He alone is going to keep His word. He alone is going to fulfill His promise. And what He does is, in this first section, He defines and clarifies the covenant. He defines the response that Abram is going to have to the covenant. And so it's very important, and we're going to see it in the intervening verses. I'm going to show you a lot of verses tonight that kind of back up what I'm trying to tell you. But it's very important that you understand Abram is already in covenant with God. God made the promise. God walked through the pieces. He is in covenant with God. We saw it way back in chapter 12 where it said Abram believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. What God is doing now in this chapter is He's going to clarify the covenant that Abram is already in relationship with God through, and He's going to give the sign of the covenant. So the covenant God makes always have signs that are associated with it. What's the sign of the Noahic covenant? Rainbow. That's right. What's the sign of the new covenant that we're in? Christ is the foundation of the new covenant. What's the sign that you do? When you get saved, what happens? Baptism is a sign of the covenant. Doesn't save you, but it's a sign of the covenant. And the sign of the old covenant here that He's going to do with Abram, not the old covenant, but the Abrahamic covenant, is going to be what? Come on, y'all know the answer. Circumcision. So we get to talk all about circumcision and foreskins and all that tonight. It's going to be awesome. No, it's not going to be awesome. Try giving this chapter to a bunch of 12-year-olds and explain it. It's no fun. No fun at all. So he says, this is what the response to the covenant should be. Abram's already in the covenant, but the response should be that you walk before me and be blameless, that I may give my covenant between me and you, that I may establish my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. When he says walk blameless, walk before me, he's talking about being open and honest before God, living an open life before God, not what we would call compartmentalizing, you know. So I have my religious life here, my spiritual life here, I have my work life here. No. You walk in all of life openly before me. You walk before my face in everything that you do, and be blameless. The word means complete. It doesn't mean sinless. We've seen Abram sin several times, and before the story's over, we're going to see him sin several more. When he says blameless, he's talking about with integrity. You know, with integrity of life, that your life is devoted to me. Same way Job is said to be blameless, the same way that, who else was said? Noah was said to be blameless in his generation. So we're talking about not a sinless life, but a life of integrity that's wholly devoted to God. That's what he's saying. Now, he's already made the covenant. He's walked through the pieces. God has, if you don't understand that, go back to chapter 15, and that's where the covenant ceremony was. God has already made the promise. And he made the promise 14 years earlier. So the idea that this is, if you want me to keep my promise, you better do that, that's not what's going on here. What he's doing is clarifying the covenant between Abram and God. He's clarifying what your response to this relationship that you are already in should be. That you walk before God, and that you live your life before Him, and that you are blameless before Him. And so he's detailing this expected response. He's explaining the relationship. And then in verse 3, he gives this reminder. Abram, when God told him this, when God speaks to him again after 13 years, when he speaks to him again and he tells him, I am the God, I'm El Shaddai, I'm God Almighty, walk before me blameless and do those things so I can give my covenant to you. Abram fell on his face. Why would he do such a thing? Simple answer. He's worship. Yeah, he's worshiping God. God speaks to him again after 14 years. He falls on his face and he worships. And God gives a reminder and an explanation of the covenant that he made 14 years earlier with Abram. So Abram fell on his face. He's worshiping. That's going to be important in a minute, that he's on his face while God's talking. He says, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you. He's not saying, if you do this, if you walk blameless and you do these things, then I'm going to make a covenant. No, my covenant is with you right now, and you shall be, it's a promise, you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. So in those first two verses, he was talking to him about his response to a covenant that he's already in, that he's already made a part of. And I'm going to prove that from the New Testament in just a minute. But he says, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. You see the promise grow, not just a great nation, but now a multitude of nations. And to solidify the growth of this promise, so the promise started as, I will make you a great nation. Now the promise is, I will make you a father of a multitude of nations. To solidify this, he changes Abram's name. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Anybody know what Abram means? Exalted father. And what does Abraham mean? Father of many nations. Yeah, very, very, very simple. So he changes his name to father of a multitude of nations. Father of many nations. How many kids does Abraham have? He's got one, really, but technically, as far as the promise of God goes, he has none, because he did all this mess with Hagar, and God's going to reject Ishmael at the end of this chapter. Anyway, so imagine he doesn't have Isaac yet. Oh, he's going to, yeah. So imagine this. You're Abram, and they know you as Abram. You've been in the land for 25 years now. We know he's got a reputation. He was dealing with the king of Sodom, dealing with Melchizedek. He went after those armies that came and took Lot. He's got a reputation in the land, and they know him as Abram. And when you see him, you say, hey, Abram. He said, well, it's not Abram anymore. It's Abraham. It's father of many nations. Oh, how many kids you got? You can imagine, he has no children of promise. I know Ishmael is his son and all that, but he has no children of promise yet as far as we know. He probably doesn't know this at the time. But he says to him, notice the tenses. So we've looked at, he says, I will make my covenant with you in the first verse. I will give my covenant to you. And then he says it in the present, behold, my covenant is with you. And then he says, future, you shall be the father of many nations. And then he says it in the past, for I have made you the father of many nations. Why does he use all the different tenses, past, present, and future, to talk about the covenant, to talk about the promise that he's going to fulfill in Abraham? Huh? Well, yeah, that's a good way to put it, I guess. She said because it was, it is, and it always will be. And the reality is that God can speak. It's called the prophetic future. He's speaking of something that is already that hasn't happened yet, but he's speaking of it in the past tense as it is a reality. It is so assured that the promise is going to be fulfilled that he can speak in the past tense. I have made you already with only one kid that I'm going to reject here in a minute. I have made you the father of many nations. And so it's very important that you understand. We're going to look at the sign of the covenant and what God tells Abraham to do. But in these first 5 verses, you need to see the covenant is already in force. He is already promised that he will be the father of many nations, that he will have these things, that he is already, it says, in covenant with God. Behold, my covenant is with you. So as he talks to Abram and he tells Abram what he wants from Abram, what you must do, what this is going to look like, it is not a stipulation in order for the covenant to be fulfilled. The covenant's already been fulfilled. God has done it by His grace and by His grace alone and according to His name. What He is talking about as we go into the sign of the covenant is the response that is expected for the promises that God has already given. Everybody understand? Questions, comments? Okay. Verse 6, he's elucidating... help me out, Dustin. He said, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. He says, I have made you father of many nations, past tense. Now back to the future tense. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations. And he says, and kings shall come from you. Now that, we know how it happened. We know the story of the line of Israel and the line of David and all those things. Kings did come from him. And the ultimate fulfillment is Jesus, the true king who came from Abraham's line. But for Abraham now, can you imagine, this is a huge promise. I mean, he's not just going to be the father of lots of people. He's not going to just be the progenitor of a bunch of nations. It says kings and royalty is going to come from him, come from his line. I mean, what a promise! Abraham right now he's a very rich tent dweller, but he's still a tent dweller. He's still a nomadic person in the land. There's the king of Sodom, and there's Melchizedek, and there's the 5 kings of all these cities, and we saw all those things as they came down through the promised land. But Abraham's not a king, but it says kings will come from your line. And in verse 7, he gives this promised relationship with the sons, the seed, the offspring of Abram. He said, I'll establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring, your seed after you, throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. Where have we seen that before? I will be your God and you will be my people. Any of y'all here Sunday? We talked about that promise. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. His seed forever. Everlasting covenant. Think about that. I'll establish with you my covenant between me and you and your offspring throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. Forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Your offspring, Abraham, I will have covenant with your offspring to be God to you and to be God to your offspring. What's the fulfillment of this promise? Whenever you get asked a question in church, yeah, the answer is Jesus. Yeah, that's right. It's always Jesus. That's right. So that's not just my opinion. That's what the New Testament tells us over and over again. So let me share a few verses with you just to show you what I'm telling you I believe is biblical and true. It says in Romans chapter 9, verse 6 through 8, Paul says, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed." He's saying, basically, he's asking, why, if God is the God of Israel and He made promises to Israel, why isn't all of Israel saved? Why are Israel rejecting the Messiah? He said, it's not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all are children of Abraham, because they are his offspring. But through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So understand what he's saying. He's saying it's not just because he's a son of Abraham that this promise applies to them. Ishmael's a son of Abraham, but the promise doesn't apply to him. And then he says, this means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. And he goes on to talk about faith being the reception of that promise, that those who have the faith of Abraham are the offspring of Abraham. So even in the New Testament, we're told that as we come to Christ and Christ regenerates us and we're united with Him, we are the offspring of Abraham. We are the seed of promise. And so this is far from just an Old Testament story that we can read and we can take some application from. This is the announcement of the gospel. This is the announcement of what God has done. This is the everlasting covenant. I will be your God and you will be my people. It's fulfilled in Jesus Christ. It's fulfilled by faith. And we're going to see that it was fulfilled by faith even in Abraham's day. I'm getting ahead of myself and we'll get there eventually, but we're going to see that as well. And then in verse 8 of Genesis, he says, "And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." And we saw last week or the week before that became a reality after Joshua, conquered the land. Questions, comments up to this point? Because from here on out, from here to the rest of the chapter, he's going to give Moses. He's going to give Abraham what his response needs to be to this covenant that God has made with him. Questions, comments, cries of outrage? Okay? What he tells him is God said to Abraham, "As for you," that's what I want you to do, "you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations." Now that's strange, isn't it? Because we've spent a lot of time in the last 2 or 3 chapters showing that the covenant was unilateral. It was God who made the covenant. It was God who didn't allow Abram to walk through the pieces in the form. It was God who made the promise. So to understand what he means by keep my covenant, you have to read it in the context that he's talking about. In verse 10, he tells us what it means to keep this covenant. He says, "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." What he says is, this is what you're going to do now that I've brought you into covenant, now I've made these promises to you. You're going to take upon yourself the sign of the covenant. You're going to take upon yourself the sign of the covenant. Now, the sign of the covenant does not save. It does not bring you into the covenant. Abraham is already in covenant. He's already in covenant with God. And this is a sign that he is in covenant with God for the rest of the world. And it comes 14 years later after God makes this covenant with him. Y'all with me? I know this is might be a little convoluted. The sign marks him out as a person who is already in covenant with God. In the same way that, it's not exactly analogous, but in the same way that baptism marks you out before the world as someone who is in covenant with Christ. Baptism doesn't bring you into covenant with Christ. It is a sign of the covenant that you are in with Christ. So I want you to picture yourself now. Abraham's 99 years old. And God comes and says, "I want you to keep my covenant." And Abraham says, "You want me to cut what?" Now, there's lots of reasons why. I mean, it's strange to talk about. You know what it is, and I'm not going to explain it to you. But one of the reasons why this particular sign is given is because it harkens back to the promise in Genesis 3. There's going to be a seed. There's going to be an offspring. There's going to be one who comes, a seed who comes, who crushes the serpent's head. And it was in... Okay, never mind. It's there that the seed is going to be... Okay, forget it. I'm done. Listen, circumcision is just a sign. It doesn't make you part of the covenant. We know that because Ishmael is going to be circumcised. Ishmael is going to be circumcised. His whole household is going to be circumcised. There are many in Israel, through the history of Israel, that were all the Israelites were circumcised, all of them. And there were lots of them that were actually separated from God because they had no faith. In fact, God's point in giving the sign of the circumcision was, for one thing, to show that there is a seed coming, but also to show as a picture of what needs to happen to the heart. Circumcision, for lack of a better way to put it, and it's kind of embarrassing and goofy, I understand that, but it's a cutting away of the foreskin. Well, God's picture is the cutting away of the hardness of the human heart. And He says that over and over again in the Old Testament. I wrote down a couple here. In Jeremiah 9, 25 and 26, He says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish all those who are circumcised merely in the flesh." It's not good enough just to be circumcised in the flesh. Egypt, Judah, Edom, the sons of Ammon, Moab, and all who dwell in the desert, who cut the corners of their hair, the beard, that was part of the law as well. For all these nations are uncircumcised, and it says the house of Israel are uncircumcised in heart. The point is not, if you do this ritual, you do this right, you're automatically in the covenant. No, this is a sign of the covenant that you have made with God through faith. He says in Deuteronomy, Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6, "Then the Lord your God," talking about what we experience in the new covenant, "the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live." We hear that language in the gospel over and over again. "I'll give you a new heart." We talk about Sunday. "Take out your stony heart. I'll put a new heart in." He phrases that new covenant, that new work of grace through faith, Spirit indwelling, by the circumcision of your heart. So circumcision in Abram's day is just a sign of what is already happened in Him. So faith is what brings Abram into the covenant. Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And 14 years later, God comes and says, "Okay, now we're going to enact the sign of the covenant." And it is the sign for us as well. I mean, not circumcision, but the circumcision of the heart. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 11, this is the way Paul describes salvation. He says, "In Him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by cutting away the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ." So when we're talking about the sign of the covenant, we're talking about the covenant with Abraham, we are talking about a picture of what is to come in the gospel. And when we talk about the sign of the covenant, we're not talking about, "Abram, you must do this work in order to be in covenant with me." We're talking about the sign of the covenant that God has placed upon Abram to show that he is already in covenant with God by faith. Everybody understand that? Y'all with me? I want to read one more passage just to solidify this point, just to make sure you understand I'm not making this up. In Romans chapter 4, Paul is talking about Abraham. He's talking about Abraham and his salvation by faith, and how it's always been salvation. He's trying to convince the Jewish people and all those things that salvation has always been by faith. And so the blessing of righteousness that's given to Abraham by his faith, in verse 9 of chapter 4, he says, "Is this blessing," talking about the blessing on Abraham, Then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? He's talking about the Gentiles being included in Abraham's covenant. He says, for we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. We read that in Genesis chapter 12. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised that he was counted righteous? Can you answer that question? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. So Paul's making the point that Abram was declared righteous in covenant with God way before he was circumcised. And then he says, goes on, and this is Romans 4 as well, he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith when he was still uncircumcised. You see that? So Paul is telling you, the Apostle Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is telling us that this sign of circumcision is a seal of the righteousness that he already had by faith when he was uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Y'all see the argument that he's making? So this is a long way around the block, and it probably got a little convoluted in there somewhere, but the point that I'm trying to make is God is commanding Abraham to be circumcised as a sign of the covenant. He's going to command that his whole household do likewise, but we need to see from the interpretation of the New Testament authors that this is a sign of what has already happened in Abraham. He is already righteous by faith. He is already in covenant with God, and this is not a work he must do to maintain his covenant. This is a sign showing the world that he is in covenant with God. Questions, comments, cries of outreach? Okay, cool. Y'all, you good and bored? This is never the most riveting lesson out of Genesis, I know. So he told him, I want you to circumcise yourself and your house. And he says, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male, throughout your generations, whether born in your house, listen, or bought with your money from any foreigner is not, wait a minute. Whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. What's that a picture of? Already. Huh? Gentiles. Already. They're taking the sign of the covenant. Already see, even back when it was instituted, already see, not just the physical descendants of Abram, but everybody in your household, even the servants that you have. Both he who is born in your home and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised, so shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Do you know the names of any of the servants in Abraham's house? We've been told two that I can think of. Hagar's one for sure. I mean, she's not going to be circumcised, but she's part of his household, part of this covenant that they're making. Who else? Eleazar, yeah, servant in his household. Man, can you imagine that conversation? So in verse 14, he says, any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh and of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So keeping the covenant that he talked about in verse 2, this is what I want you to do, is not it's not a work that you do in order to stay in covenant. It's a sign of the covenant. But if you refuse to take the sign of the covenant, what you're saying is, I do not trust the promise. I am not part of the covenant. I do not want to be in this covenant with God. And therefore, he says, if you're not refuse to take this circumcision, this sign, he said, you'll be cut off from your people. It's a demonstration of faith. And man, what a heck of a demonstration it is. I mean, you got to have some faith. You got to have some faith to do this. So to refuse the sign is to refuse to be identified with the covenant, with God. It's to reject the promises of God. and it shows that you don't have faith. You know, if somebody comes and they say, I want to trust Jesus as my Savior, I'll rejoice. Praise God. Make sure they understand the gospel. Talk to them about what it means, what they're doing. Make sure they understand what it is to trust in Jesus. And then I'll say, now you need to be baptized. Well, I don't want to be baptized. I'm not going to be baptized. Now, what's my answer? Do you need to be baptized when you're saved? What did you say? I said, yeah. That's not my answer. My answer is not, well, if you're not baptized, then you can't be a Christian. You can't get saved. No, my answer is, if you refuse to follow the first act of obedience, there's a problem with your faith, and we need to talk about, do you really believe? So that's why he says, if you won't take the sign of the covenant, you cut off from your people. It shows that you don't have the faith of those who walk in the faith of Abraham who are in this covenant. And so this is the sign of the covenant. And so he also includes Sarah. Remember we talked last time we were here about how Sarah wasn't included in the covenant, and that's why in the covenant language that God gave, and that's why, might have been why she said, well, here, take Hagar. We know, just have a child with him. Well, now God explicitly says, no, it is through Sarah that you are going to have the covenant child. He says, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her Sarai anymore, but Sarah shall be her name. I don't understand, nobody really does, because both Sarai and Sarah both mean princess. They're both derivatives of that word, mean princess. So maybe it's just, this is the establishment of something new is why he changed it. Well, I don't know for sure. I don't think anybody really does. But he says, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. He says, I will give you a son by her, I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. So what you're seeing here, God is including Sarah into the promise that He's already made Abraham. That's the same language He used when He announced the promise to Abraham. I will bless you. I will make you a great nation. Kings will come from you. The same words He used for the promise to Abraham, He uses in the promise to Sarah. She's bound to the Abrahamic promise. And so what you see here is God's telling Abraham point blank. He's saying, it's not going to be from Hagar. It's not going to be from some other place. I'm going to give you a son through Sarah, your wife. Now, this is where things get a little wonky. So remember, Abraham had fell on his face and he was worshiping when God said these things to him. So it says it again in the next verse, verse 17, that Abraham fell on his face again, I guess. So maybe he was on his knees and looking up when God, I don't know, or he got up and fell back on his face, but he laughed. It says Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And this is the reason he laughed. He says, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? He's 99 years old. Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. So it's clear why he laughed. What do you think's going on in his mind? Now, I want you to think about this. Abraham has been in the land 25 years. He was given this covenant promise, this ceremony, this beautiful ceremony of God making these promises to him. And now it's been 14 years later. I mean, 14 years is a long time. I mean, it's not really a huge long time, but it's a long time when you're waiting on a promise of God to be fulfilled. I mean, for me, God makes me a promise, and the next day I'm like, okay, I'm ready. In 48 hours, I'm like, God, did you forget? After a week, you're like, well, are you going to do it or not? Imagine 14 years. He's probably, the longer this is taking, the older they're getting. I mean, how many of you ladies would like to have a baby at 90? Probably not a good idea. Probably, yeah. So, yeah. And so the longer it takes, the older they get, and the years are passing by. And I would think, I don't know for sure, we can't put ourselves in Abraham's mind, but I mean, he's probably losing hope. He's probably frustrated. You know, we said at the beginning it could be possible that God hadn't spoken to him for 13, 14 years because it's not recorded. And so you can imagine, like, you made this promise to me 25 years ago, and still, I don't have anything. I don't have any of the things you promised. I don't have the land. I don't have a kid. I don't have any heir. I don't have any of the stuff. And then you came and renewed the promise to me 14 years ago, and here we are 14 years later. I'm almost 100 years old, and I still don't have anything. And so the laugh is not a good laugh. It's a disrespectful, dismissive laugh, I think. How is this even possible? And then in verse 18, he asks, basically pleads that Ishmael would be the son of promise. God, I've got a 13-year-old son right here. You don't have to do some great miracle. Here he is. Look, there's a son right here. All you have to do is bless this son. All you have to do is bless him and use him as the promise, and it's all solved. He's standing right here. Why? You don't have to do a miracle where we're 190 years old and she's barren anyway, been barren her whole life, and you expect me to believe that this is going to happen, and I've been waiting on it 25 years. He says, oh, that Ishmael would live before you. Let Ishmael be the son of promise. It's easy. He's right here. It's easy for sure, but who would get the glory if he gave it to Ishmael? Well, he's half Egyptian, but who would get the glory? Sarah or Hagar or Abraham. Wouldn't be God. Wouldn't be God. And that's not the way God works. That's not how God operates. You know, I think God loves impossible situations. I think He loves it when His people are too weak to do anything, when it's impossible and it can't come about, and the only thing that will prevail is some miracle, some situation that's just impossible. Because in those moments, God gets the glory. God reveals Himself in a mighty way. You know, if I'm able to do it in my own strength, and you know, God does use other means, I'm not saying that, but I think He loves it when His people's back are against the wall. And the only deliverance that is explainable is that God is powerful and almighty. He is El Shaddai. And I think that's why He introduced this section as I am El Shaddai. I am God Almighty. I am able to make your old barren wife have a kid. I'm able to make you 100 years old and have a kid. I'm able to do these things. So when He says that Ishmael, let Ishmael live before you, Abram's thinking, this is a lost cause. But I have a son already. If you'll just bless him, everything will be fine. Understand, God don't need our counsel. He knows exactly what He's doing. And so God says, no. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Yitzhak, is how it's pronounced. It's Isaac. What is Yitzhak? What does Isaac mean? It means laughter. Yeah, he laughs. Can you imagine? Can you imagine Isaac growing up, and every time Abraham calls his name, he's reminded of a time that he doubted God? You laughed. You laughed. Your son's name is laughter. Isaac. He says, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. And we see the covenant promise move again. We saw it move from Noah to Shem. Then we saw it move to Abram when he called him out of Ur of the Chaldees. Now we see it move not to Ishmael, but to Isaac. The covenant promise moves again. And here's the thing about God. He's going to do it His way, and His way is the best way, but He is also so gracious. He says in the next verse, as for Ishmael, I love this. He says, I've heard you. I've heard you. Your request is that, oh, that Ishmael would live before me. He said, I've heard you. So behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful, multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you. And then he gives the time frame. At this time next year. God let Abraham and Sarah go 25 years waiting on the promise. And finally, God tells them, by this time next year, you're going to have a son. And He was gracious enough to bless Ishmael. Not because Ishmael is such a great guy, but because Abraham interceded for him. He was a physical offspring of Abram. So He promises to bless him. He promises within a year. That means Sarah's going to be 90 years old, 91 years old when she has this baby. And besides the fact that she's old, she's been barren her whole life. It's going to be a miracle of epic proportions, an impossible promise. Now here's where we just have to put ourselves in Abraham's place and just imagine, because I don't know. God made this promise that you're going to have a son. Abram laughs. I'm 100 years old, man, and my wife's 90 years old. We're too old to have a son. Why don't you just use Ishmael? He laughs at the promise. And then God says, no, this is what's going to happen. She's going to have a son. She's going to have him within a year. But I'll bless your other son too. But my covenant is going to be with Isaac. And this time, Abraham doesn't laugh. This time, by faith, he obeys God. So in verse 22, he says, when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abram, and then immediately, then Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, every single one, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. He obeyed. You see his faith in action. If we are in covenant with God, He's made these promises, then we need to demonstrate the sign of that covenant. We need to make sure that we are obedient to what God has asked us to do. And at 99 years old, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Abraham circumcised himself at 99 years old. I'm not going to give you no graphic description, but I guarantee you that was not a fun thing to go through. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. Last verse it says, and all the men of his house, those born in the house, those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So what you see here is a very intense and very picturesque view of God reminding Abraham of his covenant, reaffirming Abraham's covenant, promising the same promise that He'd been promising, you will have a son. Now He gives him a time frame. It will be within a year that you will have a son. And He says, this is what I want you to do. You are in covenant with me now. I want you to take the sign of the covenant upon yourself. And this sign of the covenant will be all the way through Israel's history. It will mark them out as people who are in covenant with God. But the circumcision itself doesn't make them in covenant with God. It's faith that makes them in covenant with God. You understand what I'm saying? The same way somebody could come up and be baptized, and that's not going to help them be in covenant with God. It's not going to save them. It's not going to do anything. It's a sign of what has happened in reality in my faith in my heart. Circumcision is the same way. Questions, comments, cries of outrage? Yes. Yeah?
I know it's minuscule, but isn't it kind of the old tradition that when you name or rename somebody, you show ownership?
When you name somebody, it's so you're showing authority. Let's not say ownership. You're showing authority. But the problem with that is Sarai and Sarah both mean the same thing. So with Abraham, he changed his name to reflect the promise. You're not the exalted father anymore. You're the father of many nations. To be honest, I don't know. I don't know why.
Why would it say he did it if it wasn't significant? It says
I'm sure there's some significance. I'm just telling you, I don't know what it is.
maybe that's just a way to show Abraham, hey, I didn't say it first time around and you messed up, so.
Maybe so. Maybe so. The best I could come up with maybe is that it denotes something new, a new relationship with Sarah as well, bringing her into the covenant. Because they thought that she wasn't. I think they thought she wasn't. That's why she gave Hagar. Hopefully we'll have the son of promise through Hagar. This is never the most riveting deal because we're talking about something that's, let's just be honest, it's a little embarrassing to talk about it, but it is a sign of the covenant, and we're going to see it again if Moses is going to circumcise his son, and we're going to talk about it a lot, but it's the sign of God's covenant for his covenant people at that time, and he institutes it as a sign, not as this is what makes you in covenant. Any other questions?